Welcome to today's webinar. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Grace Nicolette. I'm Vice President of Programming and External Relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And today I'm excited to welcome you to our webinar on Persevering Through Crisis, the State of Nonprofits, based on a newly released resource from CEP on how nonprofits have fared over the last year or so or more with the pandemic and multiple crises, what they need from funders now. For those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Effective Philanthropy, we're a nonprofit with offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and San Francisco. CEP provides data, feedback, programs, and insights to help individuals and institutional donors improve their effectiveness. We do this work because we believe effective donors working collaboratively and thoughtfully can profoundly contribute to creating a better and more just world. As a nonprofit, we rely heavily on grant funding and individual donations, in addition to the earned revenue from our assessments. I hope you'll listen today and consider supporting CEP's work, whether by inquiring about a foundation assessment, underwriting a new piece of research that will benefit the field of philanthropy, like the one we'll be discussing today, or a simple dues-like financial gift. We'll be sharing a few links in the chat box on how to get in touch with us, so thank you in advance. Next, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items for our time today. First, we are in a webinar format, which means all of you are muted and have your videos off upon entering the session. If you have questions for the panelists during today's presentation, and we hope you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. We'll try to be as responsive as we can during the Q&A time at the end of the webinar. You'll notice that you'll not see the other questions in the chat, but rest assured that there are other attendees who are likely asking questions at the same time. We'll also be sharing some resources with you via the chat box, so feel free to check there for helpful links and resources that are mentioned throughout the conversation today. We will not be using the hand-raising function on the webinar, as we're not asking attendees to speak their questions. If you require technical assistance at any time during this webinar, please reach out to my colleague, Say Darling, at saed@cep.org, and he can assist you. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link out to all registrants in a follow-up email. And so we'll also send a follow-up email with the links to any resources that we mentioned today. Now, I'd like to introduce CEP's president, Phil Buchanan, who will be our moderator today, and our colleague, Hannah Martin, a manager on our research team, will be sharing the key findings from this report. After they're finished, we'll be inviting on our special guests today. They are Jared Barrios, Senior Vice President, Strategic Community and Programmatic Initiatives at the California Community Foundation, David Lee, CEO of Imagine MKE, Milwaukee's Coalition of Arts, Culture, and Civic Leaders, and Dara Munson, President and CEO of Family Focus, which invests in strengthening families and their children in Chicago and Northeast Illinois. So now I'm going to hand it over to Phil.
Thanks so much, Grace. Really appreciate you welcoming everyone. So glad to have so many folks on this webinar. Grace, I should note, is co-host with me of a podcast that I hope you'll check out called Giving Done Right. That's my little advertisement. But now to the purpose of today, which is really to dive into the question of what the nonprofit experience was over the past year and a half. And I think back to a webinar we did about 13 months ago when folks were reeling and human services organizations were facing unprecedented demand. We all saw the lines of cars at food pantries. Revenue was very unclear, the revenue picture. Arts organizations had shuttered and ticket sales evaporated. And many of us in the sector were calling on foundations and other donors to step up. Organizations like Independent Sector and the National Council for Nonprofits worked incredibly hard to try to ensure that the PPP program was available to nonprofits. And of course, then nonprofit leaders did so much heroic work in very difficult conditions. And so that webinar 13 months ago was based on a survey we did of nonprofits on a panel that is representative of foundation-funded nonprofits. And Hannah Martin, who I'm going to invite on to join now, did that research along with Kate Galing and Ellie Buteau, who's our vice president for research, and shared with everybody the findings at the time. And we thought it was important to look again and see where are we now. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to hear from Hannah about what we learned in our research. And then we're going to bring in our amazing 3 discussants, panelists, whose bios I'll tell you a little bit about after Hannah speaks, but they're truly ridiculous in the sense that they have just such a wealth of experience as leaders in the sector. And I know it's going to be a great conversation. And toward the end, we're really going to try to say, like, where do we go from here? What did we learn? What can donors and foundations take away from this experience? What did we learn about nonprofits? What did we learn about philanthropy? But for now, let me turn it to Hannah, who's going to take about 10 minutes and share with us what she and her colleagues learned. So thank you, Hannah. Over to you.
Thank you, Phil. All right. There we go. So as Phil was saying, last June, CEP published research about how nonprofit organizations were faring at the beginning of the pandemic. We found that while COVID was having devastating impacts on nonprofits, the negative impacts were magnified for nonprofits that provide direct services or serve historically disadvantaged communities. A lot has changed since then, from the racial justice movement to the election to the development of vaccines. Where do nonprofits stand today? To answer this question, we fielded a survey to our Grantee Voice panel, which is a national sample of CEOs from nonprofit organizations that receive at least one grant from large US-based foundations, with large being defined as giving $5 million or more annually. It's important to note that the nonprofits in our study are likely larger and more financially secure than nonprofits that do not receive grants from large foundations. In February, we received responses from 163 nonprofit leaders for a response rate of 29%. Nonprofits represented by leaders who responded to the survey did not differ significantly from non-respondent organizations by annual expenses, staff size, or geographic region. We also received a response rate of 29% to our survey last year. Additionally, the organizational expenses and staff sizes for respondents to both surveys are very similar. Not all of the respondents to the 2 surveys were the same, but because overall the organizations they represent are so similar in size and also in geographic region, we were able to compare data across the 2 time periods, which I'll do throughout this presentation. From the 2021 survey, we drew 3 key findings. First, most nonprofit leaders report that the COVID-19 pandemic has had negative impacts on their organizations and has affected their programming, revenue, demand, and costs. Arts and culture organizations have experienced more negative effects from the pandemic, while community and economic development organizations have experienced fewer negative effects. 2, increased financial support from foundations, individual donors, and the government, including the Paycheck Protection Program funding, helped nonprofits to fare better in 2020 than their leaders had originally anticipated. And 3, many nonprofits report that their foundation funders were flexible, responsive, and communicative in 2020. However, nonprofits led by women and nonprofits serving certain communities, including Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, and Native American communities, experienced somewhat less flexibility, responsiveness, and communication than other nonprofits. Let's dive deeper into key finding 1 about the negative impacts of the pandemic. Most nonprofit leaders responding to our survey report that COVID-19 is having some degree of negative impact on their organizations, with 2/3 reporting a moderate or a significant negative impact. The majority of leaders whose organizations have experienced negative impacts describe facing difficulties in carrying out their programs and services. In fact, most nonprofit leaders report that they had to alter or reduce their programs or services in 2020. These programmatic challenges were compounded by financial challenges. Most nonprofit leaders said that their organization's revenue decreased in 2020, which was primarily driven by decreases in earned revenue. At the same time, half of nonprofit leaders say demand for their programs or services increased, and 39% say that their costs increased. We found differences in the impact of COVID-19 on nonprofits based upon their program areas. Leaders of arts and culture organizations rate the impact on their organizations more negatively. One such leader says, "Our earned revenue is down by more than 50%. Audiences are not able to attend live performances. We lack confidence in what lies ahead." By contrast, leaders of community and economic development organizations rate the impact of COVID-19 on their organizations less negatively. One such leader says, "Our work is in higher demand. This has increased our overall revenue and our programmatic offerings." Now let's turn to key finding 2 about nonprofits faring better in 2020 than their leaders originally anticipated. Despite the obvious negative impact that the pandemic has had on most organizations, nonprofit leaders who responded to our survey this year rate the impact less negatively than those who responded to our survey last year. Last May, almost half of leaders said the pandemic was having a significant negative impact on their organization at the time of the survey. Whereas this February, less than 1/3 said that the pandemic was having a significant negative impact on their organization at that time. And while most nonprofit leaders who responded to our survey last May said they had already or expected to reduce programs or services and draw from reserves, fewer of those who responded to our survey this year report ultimately having taken these actions in 2020. Many nonprofits fared better than expected because of the support that they received from funders. More than half of nonprofit leaders report that their grants from government sources and foundations increased in 2020, and almost half report that their gifts from donors increased. The vast majority applied for a loan through the Paycheck Protection Program, and 99% received loans. As of February, about 2/3 had already applied for forgiveness on their loan, and of those who had received a decision, almost all had the full amount forgiven. However, when it comes to increased foundation funding, not all communities benefited equally. Most nonprofit leaders whose organizations primarily serve Middle Eastern, Asian, Pacific Islander, or Native American communities report that no foundations provided new funding in 2020 to support these communities. This is concerning given the ways in which existing inequities facing these communities were further exacerbated by the pandemic, and for Asian communities, the rise in racist violence and hate crimes. I'll note that nonprofit leaders whose organizations primarily serve Black or Hispanic communities report that more foundations provided support for these communities, though there is certainly room for foundations to continue to step up. And finally, let's turn to key finding 3 about foundation flexibility, responsiveness, and communication, and the disparities we see for women in nonprofits serving certain communities. Many nonprofit leaders report receiving new flexible program support or unrestricted support from their foundation funders in 2020. As one leader says, "The most helpful support from foundations was unrestricted funds that could be utilized for operational expenses. Funder flexibility this year has been paramount." Beyond experiencing greater flexibility in new foundation grants, many nonprofit leaders report that at least some of their foundation funders took a variety of actions to be more flexible, responsive, and communicative, including communicating about future funding, communicating proactively and regularly, allowing the goals of existing grants to shift, and lifting up the voices of the people and communities they serve. However, nonprofits led by women, the majority of organizations in our study, are less likely than those led by men to report experiencing some of these things. Women report that fewer of their foundation funders communicated about future funding, allowed the goals of existing grants to shift, supported their engagement in public policy, asked for feedback on their grant-making practices, provided new multi-year grants, and understand what they need at this time. Similarly, leaders of nonprofits primarily serving Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, or Native American communities report that fewer of their foundation funders lifted up the voices of the people and communities they serve. Those primarily serving Asian and Middle Eastern communities also say that fewer of their foundation funders supported their engagement in public policy. Further, those primarily serving Asian communities say that fewer foundations provided new unrestricted support, and those primarily serving Middle Eastern communities say that fewer foundations communicated proactively and regularly. To sum up, although the COVID-19 pandemic has had clear negative impacts on nonprofits, especially arts and culture organizations, support from funders helped them fare better than anticipated. Many nonprofits were given increased financial support and flexibility. And yet, our data also reveal differences in the ways that foundations supported nonprofits led by women and nonprofits primarily serving Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, and Native American communities. We hope that funders will take the time to reflect on the choices they make and the systems they use that contribute to these differences. And on one final note, in their survey responses, some nonprofit leaders worried that the increased support and flexibility they experienced from foundations and donors will dissipate in the near future, leaving their organizations in the lurch. One nonprofit leader says, "There is still so much uncertainty about the rest of 2021 and perhaps even into 2022. We need unrestricted funds and flexibility in the timing of their use. The challenges and expenses we anticipate now may change in a matter of weeks or months." And with that, I'll turn it over to Phil to get our discussion started.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that really, really clear presentation, really helpful. I'd like to invite Dara, David, and Jarrett to join now and just say just a couple of words about each of them. I said before that their bios are ridiculous, and I meant that as a compliment. Just incredible wealth of experience and really great illustration of the amazing leadership that resides in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. So Dara, whose birthday it is, happy birthday, Dara, is President and CEO of Family Focus and formerly the CEO of Chicago Child Care Society. She has also been President and CEO of Big Brother Big Sisters of Metro Detroit, past COO of Girl Scouts of Southeastern Michigan, and past Senior Director of United Way of Southeastern Michigan. And that's just a few of the roles that she's had. David Lee is the leader of Imagine MKE, which is a convener, connector, and amplifier of the arts and culture community in Milwaukee. But interestingly, he's also had leadership roles on the sort of human services side, most really recently as the founding executive director at Feeding Wisconsin, where he drove that organization's growth and development. And his bio goes on and on with all kinds of interesting tidbits, including that in one production, David played Audrey Hepburn, Elvis Presley, a mystical Cuban, and himself in what was hailed as a performance of campy perfection, which is pretty good. I like that one. And then, of course, Jarrett Barrios, Senior Vice President of Strategic Communications and Programmatic Initiatives at the California Community Foundation, where he oversees all the strategy and leads programmatic initiatives, marketing, communications, policy, and advocacy. He has also served as CEO of American Red Cross of Los Angeles, the Massachusetts Red Cross, GLAAD, and the Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation here where I am of Massachusetts. He's also served in the Massachusetts legislature, and I distinctly remember his lawn signs from when I would drive into work. So these are really some terrific leaders to reflect on what we just heard from Hannah. And I guess before I even get to asking each of you a little bit about your own experience, which I want to do, any just top line reactions to the data you just heard from Hannah?
You know, Phil, I was just thinking as Hannah was going through the study that it tracks with our experience here in Milwaukee. I think the feeling around this time last year was that, you know, the world was falling down. And now a year later, I think it feels like the world continues to be tough, but not as scary as it was last year.
Phil,
Jared?
I'd like to just particularly call out the stuff about some of the unique challenges of the arts that you guys recognized, that while many organizations are coming back, it's only now where organizations that are in the arts, and I know it's called earned income in the report, but, you know, it basically means butts in seats, right? People coming back to the theater, to whatever the performance venue is, that's when the money is needed, right? And this is why it's a particularly scary moment for them, and that I'm sure that the Delta variant isn't helping at all with that, about whether now is the time. So there's a particular tension there, and I appreciate you guys calling that out. We run an arts fund at our foundation, and we see that regularly with a lot of our grantees.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared.
Phil, I would just add what really struck me was the theme of that nonprofit organizations are very resilient. Like, we literally figure it out on the fly when we have to, because we're serving community. And it reminds me, though, of the resilience that our families and children have exhibited, but that comes from issues surrounding them, and issues that are their reality that we really don't want to be their reality, right? When you want to build a muscle based on, from a much more positive approach, a much more positive perspective, versus having to literally figure out life on the fly because you're at or below the poverty level. So just for me, it was an aha moment to hear, you know, what you know to be true, a reminder of how resilient the sector is, but because for reasons that we really hope not to be true in the future.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Dara. And let's stick with you. And so don't mute yourself yet, and tell us a little bit about what you and your organization went through. You know, what has your experience been? Because I know from talking to you that it's been incredibly intense. So, you know, give us a little sense of what population do you serve? How were they impacted? And what did you do as a result?
Thank you. Our organization serves children and families. The majority of our work is in early childhood education, youth development, and family support. And it was very interesting in serving young children and families, having to figure out how to do that in a Zoom room for 3-year-olds. Because the bonding and attachment, everything you know to be true about early childhood education cannot be supported through Zoom. But we had to figure out how to stay in touch, because a lot of the work also has to do with ensuring that children and families are safe. And so our team members our teachers and other staff members, family advocates and parent supporters, really had to figure out how to remain in touch with our children and families, especially in the first, the shelter in place, because they're coming from a variety of challenges and issues. And so we had to make sure they had devices and actually figure out services for them that really is not our forte, but because we're a trusted partner. And if our families tell us they need food, we will find them food. If they need shelter, we're finding them shelter. And so we actually figured out a different way of working that our funders actually supported in housing advocacy, because of such a magnificent need on the part of our families. So the pivot is a word that I know that has been overused in the pandemic, but when you are serving community, especially the youngest learners and little ones who need bonding attachment, and we really need to figure out how to help their brain development, we really do, we had to transfer our skill set to a different one in order to be there and continue to be there for them.
All right, you just said that the funders supported your adaptation, and that, of course, was a huge focus of discussion in the funder community. A bunch of funders took a pledge and said, we will try to restricted dollars where we can. We will try to make more unrestricted grants. And so you really experienced that from your donors, it sounds like. Was that something you had to ask for, or did they offer it? Tell us just a little bit more about that.
Sure, and it actually, Phil, it was a little bit of both. So there were some funders here locally in Illinois who called on organizations with which they already had good relationships and were a trusted partner and anchor in the community. And so they knew they could trust us to receive X amount of dollars and get it to families as quickly as possible. And it had to be unrestricted. It had to be specifically for those families' needs. So we benefited from around $500,000, $500,000 that we were able to then get directly to families for any type of financial support or food support. And that was very, very helpful. But what we also learned was that our families were experiencing housing insecurity to a degree that we had not anticipated, and ended up receiving, in addition to those private dollars, funding from the state to support housing advocacy. It was the largest grant in our organization's history, to the tune of $5 million. And so we began to do health navigator work and housing advocacy for these families that were already in our care.
That's great. I mean, if ever there was a moment where folks might realize that overly restricting the funding of organizations whose goals largely overlap with you as a donor doesn't make sense, it would have been, the past 16 months. And my hope is that triggers an insight going forward. We realize, we trusted these organizations and they delivered. Maybe that can tell us something about how we fund going forward. Let's turn to you, David. And obviously you're in this area that we talked about that was sort of, massively impacted by the no butts in seats that Jarrett referred to. Tell us what your organization was about, in February 2020, and then what it was about once the pandemic hit.
Sure. So, we were organized in 2018 to be a collective impact sort of convening organization for our sector, right? So bringing together stakeholders in business, in arts, in government, and artists to advance a collective shared agenda towards creating a more thriving, vibrant Milwaukee powered by the arts. And we were just about to begin to accelerate that work when COVID happened. And I think we quickly saw that in-person convening obviously couldn't happen anymore, and that with the decrease or with the cut of ability to actually sell tickets and get people into buildings, and also for artists and creatives to play at to play or show at bars and do all that stuff was just cut off. We quickly stood up an artist relief fund, and to sort of highlight on some of the previous commentary on unrestricted funds. I mean, we quickly were able to raise about $300,000 to distribute to artists in small micro grants, right? And clearly, this was. I think we also recognized that that this problem was not the nonprofit communities to solve, right? This required a government solution. And so our goal with these microgrants was to bridge sort of that uncertainty between having all your gigs canceled to when potentially expanded unemployment was coming down the pike. And as an organization that had no granting history, for us to sort of make that shift, because I think we recognize that our highest and best use was that we had a bank account and we had somebody who was willing to write checks. It was me, right? Like you mentioned that I'd come from the food bank world, and my perspective in fighting hunger was, let's give people money, right? If we trust people to do the best thing for themselves, what a great way to just give people money to be able to do that thing. And so that was just, I think we sort of established this idea of what's the minimum viable accountability to ensure that people could prove that they had a creative practice, they had lost a gig, and if they sort of crossed those barriers, we prioritized money to them.
I love that phrase so much, minimum viable accountability. So that sort of adaptation, the trust that donors placed in you to be able to find who needed support, and then the trust that you placed in the folks that you supported. David, how does this make you think about the work going forward? I mean, like, when you reflect on this, does it change your perspective on the future of your organization, of the way philanthropy is practiced? Did it lead to any sort of new insights? Because you've been in this world a while. What did you take from this experience?
What's funny, Phil? I was told a story early on as a startup organization, right? We had a whole bunch of folks kind of participating in the creation of our organization, and I was taken out to breakfast by one of our stakeholders, and he had shared that, like, in all of our planning process, his view was, whatever this organization is, it should give people money, right? And then when we ended up starting to give people money, he had reached out and it was like, hey, has the mission changed? Because if so, I'm all for it. And I had to share with him that, it hasn't necessarily, right? I mean, we really saw like an opportunity to be able to fill an important need for our community. And I should also note too, by the way, that there had not been a standing emergency artist relief fund here in Milwaukee before ours, right? And obviously, it's not always a global pandemic that sort of shuts down an artist's ability to earn, right? Sometimes there's family tragedy, an accident. And I think that allowed us to sort of have a broader conversation about why this is important, and whether it's us or somebody else. I think it was an important conversation for us to have. And at the same time, I should also note that Wisconsin is 49th in the nation in public funding for the arts, and we jumped up from 50th only because Arizona zeroed out their state appropriation, right? So we increased by the misfortune of others. And similarly, Milwaukee City and County are similarly not as well highly leveraged as they could be, given the impact of our sector. And so I think this also allowed us to sort of advance that conversation about why it was so important for our public sector to establish an emergency fund through our advocacy and public policy work. And if I could just one final point here, and I think this is really important, actually. In that time last year, I had so many conversations with donors and elected officials about, like, hey, it's a worldwide pandemic. How can we justify supporting the arts versus supporting rental assistance or food banks or basic needs? And I got to tell you, like, when you support an arts and culture organization or an artist, you're not supporting a building. You're supporting the people who work in that building and all of the things that building supports, right? Like, insofar as all the jobs and all of that kind of thing, right? And I think that was an interesting mind shift for people when they realized that when you support the arts, you're actually keeping people, to the extent possible, from needing many of these other basic needs services as much or as frequently as they might otherwise.
It's so interesting, because so many of the conversations that we at CEP had with foundations as well as with individual donors was about the fact that if you were going to be responsive to what was happening in ways that led you to make grants to organizations you hadn't supported previously, and you wanted to make sure that those organizations that you had supported previously made it through, there was no escaping what that meant. It meant give more.
Yeah.
Give more than you planned, give more than you did in the past. And from the data, from Giving USA, for example, we can see that foundations did that. Individual donors, it was a, less clear story. If you back out McKinsey Scott, actually slight decline, in part because so many middle income givers were so hard hit themselves and so uncertain about what they could do. But I think, and Hannah alluded to it, there's a worry now about, what next. But I want to bring Jarrett in, and Jarrett, you're at a community foundation. Community foundations played an unbelievably important role in this period as a bridge between individuals who thought, I have to help, I have resources, I want to do something, and then organizations in communities, some of which are small and maybe donors wouldn't have found them themselves. Tell us what your experience was.
Thanks, Phil, for the question. And there's a variety of foundations. We all played different roles. Private foundations were critical. Community foundations a little different, as you recognized. Our endowments per se, and we have an endowment at CCF, California Community Foundation, but our discretionary giving was only a small part of what we overall did. And first of all, we saw, let me just sort of validate David and Dara, we saw what you are talking about in LA, right? We're a community foundation in LA County. It is not unique to Chicago, Milwaukee. I think this was a national phenomenon. And how we responded, sort of practically speaking, we did what I call handshake grants. We sort of moved in a very different direction to get the money to where it was needed, which was to organizations like Dara's and David's. And what a handshake grant, that's just my shorthand, no applications, no reporting at the end. Essentially, give me a couple of paragraphs. My grant officers would get me a couple of paragraphs. I'd get a quick approval taken out, and the money would go out. We also, as part of that, we went into new areas. Food was an area that we really hadn't done before. Rental assistance. We did have a very small program in hardship, but I think it grew by 12 times over in terms of the amount of dollars we were moving through it on an annual basis. So all of that was how we responded. I would mention that we did a few other things which were perhaps we would have thought out of our comfort zone to be pre-COVID. Overall, we did about, I think I was looking at the numbers, it was about $145 million total. Of that, 60 million, I hope these numbers add up. Of the $60 million was from our donor advised fund. So it wasn't our dollars. It was dollars from our donors that we steered towards, to your point, Phil, these are donors that we connected with organizations that needed them.
Right.
The rest of it was dollars either from our discretionary or through partners that were giving through us. Some of those were government partners. We did a couple of CARES Act partnerships, a partnership with federal dollars. We also did a partnership with the state. Those were all COVID related, health education, food insecurity. We also did partnerships with other foundations. We did a big arts fund, which I mentioned earlier. The last thing I'll note, and I really think this was important, because not that it's easy to get money out quick, but I think it's easy to think that we've solved the problem by doing those handshake grants. But there was an important part of sort of reflection that we tried to do, and we did that with data. We looked at social vulnerability data. We looked at public health data as to where the cases were, so that we could understand where the virus, where the pandemic was impacting, literally geographically on maps, and then mapping where the funds we had spent, where the service organizations were actually serving. And we found some holes, and that allowed us to double down and really try harder to reach parts of the county, of LA County, which I know it sounds like a county, that's not so very big, but there's 10.5 million people in LA County. It's bigger than 42 states. So we were able to identify pockets. It was about 20% area we saw wasn't covered. And then as we continued to make grants, double down on those areas, work a little harder to find new organizations. And to your earlier point, we found ourselves making grants to a lot of organizations we had never made grants before to.
And Jarrett, just staying with you here, has that shifted how you will work in the future?
No, I'd like to think, first of all, a lot of those are organizations that we have more than a handshake with now, right? We've learned about them along the way, and it is creating an openness to new organizations, hopefully that we will fund. I think it is making us think about also what we require as part of our grants, and while nothing is firm yet, it is making us evaluate it. And then we are also doing a lot of root cause analysis and more sort of questions around equity in grant making. Some of that is geographic, a lot of it is connected to fundamentally this question in the context of COVID. If it's a question for how we do grant making COVID, it should also be a question for how we do grant making post COVID, right? That is, are we meeting the needs that our community has to create a more equitable, a fairer place to live in Los Angeles County? And if those questions are relevant in COVID, they're also relevant. And so they should probably carry over to how we think about our grant making in a post-COVID world, which hopefully we will be in sometime soon.
Thank you. And I have this theory, and I'm curious whether the folks think it's right or not, that there was a recognition, like you talked, Jared, about the new organizations that you sort of discovered as really crucial, that as we all saw that the pandemic from both a health and an economic standpoint was massively disproportionately impacting certain communities, which many people said should be no surprise, but it was still stark, right? There was this realization that if you wanted to be responsive, that often meant funding smaller organizations. Why? Because often they were the organizations that were rooted in and trusted by communities, right? So there has been a tendency, I think, in the world of at least certain parts of the philanthropic world to sort of fetishize scale and size, and scale can be important, but smallness can be an asset because it can be connected to trust in communities. Do you, any of the three of you, do you think that's right? And do you think we'll see more of that from donors? Dara?
I do think it's right. And I think it's a both and. There are definitely organizations, and I've learned of some here in Metro Chicago, that are so closely linked to the communities that they're in and of the communities. They have the ear and the trust of residents. Even when you think about issues around crime, there are organizations that are so grassroots that they have the trust of the community. So I fully agree with you, Phil. And I also think that this creates an opportunity for larger organizations to collaborate and partner in ways that we might not have otherwise thought about, right? As a former funder, I know that I have talked to organizations about when and how to partner with other like organizations. Sometimes it's very, very challenging. But what I think what the tragedy of the multiple pandemics that we're looking at has done is provided us as community to really think about our role in having shared accountability for our brothers and our sisters. And there is a role to really create the much stronger fabric of community that the pandemic has gifted us. It literally smacked us in the face. So right. I would agree with you wholeheartedly that there is space to really think about smaller organizations, right? But those that are very nimble and very flexible and have a very clear understanding of the needs of community and how to effectively address them, and could possibly receive capacity building funds and support to then grow and to scale, to the degree that they're comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Hannah, as you listen to this, I just want to invite you, because you have read many, many comments, open-ended comments from nonprofits, nonprofit executive directors, not from just this survey, but other surveys we've conducted. And I wonder if there's anything you want to add from what you saw. Does this feel, do Dara and Jared and David's perspectives feel consistent with what you saw in some of those open-ended comments? And is there anything else that you're thinking is a theme that you saw that we should touch on here?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I think that what Dara and David and Jarrett have all talked about rings true to the comments that I read. Dara, when you were talking about the people you serve having different needs than you possibly anticipated they would, it reminded me of a comment I read from a leader of a food bank talking about how people who used to be regular donors to the food bank were now in line for a meal, and just how quickly those needs were changing. So I think that definitely rings true. There were a lot of comments from people about that theme, about the needs just being astronomical. So yeah, I would say that definitely rings true.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to do is encourage people listening in to submit your questions. I know we had one question that I think this data doesn't speak to, but some other data that we developed last year on sort of the foundation response perhaps does. And the question really was about the racial equity commitments and the investment in particular. This question is about investment in Black-led organizations, and the person in the audience wants to understand, like, do we see an increase in support for organizations either led by certain communities or serving certain communities in the data? And I think, Hannah, you can help me remember from our study at the end of last year. I think the answer is yes, for Black and Latino-led organizations and communities, and less so, correct, Hannah, for some of the other communities that you highlighted?
Yes, that's exactly correct.
I want to make sure that we really focus on implications for donors and foundations. So knowing that this is an audience today that is mostly in that category as opposed to nonprofit leaders, I think you've all touched on this, but I want to make sure you really have an opportunity to say what good stuff happened that you saw donors do that you hope continues, or maybe what didn't happen that you would like to see happen, because this was an unprecedented time. And it's funny because, like, I had some people say to me after this report came out, well, Phil, you were carrying on about how terrible this was going to be for nonprofits, and they appear to have done better, so I guess you were wrong. And of course, defensively, my view is no, actually many of us were carrying on about this, and a whole lot of folks stepped up, and hugely, and we haven't maybe given this the attention it deserves, the federal government provided crucial support. And again, I think Dan Cardinale at Independent Sector, Tim Delaney at the National Council for Nonprofits, Kathleen Enright at the Council on Foundations, a number of other folks worked really, and I'm sure I don't even know everybody who worked, to try to make sure that nonprofits were included in that funding. And an aside, like, how could it ever have been possible that they weren't sort of front and center from the very beginning? But they weren't. Anyway, I digress. Back to the question, what would you like to see foundations and donors continue to do or do as we now look forward and hopefully begin to emerge from this crisis, Delta variant notwithstanding? Jarrett?
Yeah, I'd some of the stuff that I'll say my kind of favorite things, if it's possible to characterize anything as good coming out of COVID, were some of the interesting partnerships between small and large nonprofits. And this is kind of getting to your earlier question. Do you give large or do you give small? Well, in some cases, you actually, to get small, you give large, in that you will have larger organizations acting as fiscal sponsors for many smaller ones. One example I'll give you, we did a lot of work doing vaccine hesitancy education, and we're still actually obviously engaged in that. And to reach many of the smaller organizations who really didn't have the nonprofit status, I mean, they're very grassroots organizations, we would fund larger organizations that were sort of not exactly the fiscal sponsor, right? They would partner with these and then move the dollars very quickly. But the promotoras, the people that were actually out on the streets doing the work, were connected to very small grassroots organizations, some of whom, again, were not even official recognized nonprofits, but there would be sort of informal partnerships that, because of the urgency of this, it was organizations pulled together. That kind of collaboration, as opposed to competition, which is sometimes what you see in competing for dollars, right? That kind of collaboration was a real welcome thing that I hope we can continue forward.
Thank you,
Phil,
David.
I'm sorry. I think for me, there are a couple of things, right? I think the first thing is that, I think what we saw was that the stress of what happened last year, sort of people showed up, right? And I think people and foundations showed up in ways that the community wanted them to. And I think you'd made this point a little earlier, right? That the trust that these organizations, these donors have shown in the organizations in the thick of it are going to be the same organizations on the other side of it, right? So I think sort of maximizing and prioritizing that sense of trust and flexibility is really, really important. And I think this goes to that sense of having a real conversation about overhead, right? That, like, in our world, at our organization, our people are the ones that provide the programming. And there's no, like, we don't have a kids program, a traditional kids program that donors and foundations oftentimes want to see, right? But we are the ones doing the convening. We're the ones out there doing the advocacy. And so that, in some ways, is the programming that service organizations like ours provide. That goes to the point too, which is, with all of these federal funds coming through with CARES last year, ARPA this year, and then whatever potential infrastructure bill coming down the pipeline, these are generational investments into our community, including the nonprofit sector, and, I mean, for us, the arts and culture community, right? And so how do we sort of join in some of the advocacy work, which I think is so important, insofar as being able to educate our community, elected officials, general public about the importance of these dollars to our community, right? Because they're going to go away. And we have a limited amount of time to sort of make it all, happen. And then I think, just to sort of circle back on the scale question, we have some organizations here that are strategically small and strategically nomadic, as they sort of self-describe themselves.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, I think in our funding community, at least, like, scale is a proxy for quality. If people can't understand what's good or bad, if it's bigger, it must be better. And so thinking about, like, how we get to a place where we're sort of funding, at least in our community, and I'm sure this is reflective across the nation, right? A healthy ecosystem of arts and culture organizations, and more broadly speaking, a social sector where you have deeply rooted community organizations, and also the large organizations that are able to reach hundreds of thousands of people, right? And so I think that those are probably the three things that continue to be front of mind for me.
That's great.
I'll just add two very quick points, Phil. You talked about the support for organizations led by people of color and led by women, and we all know how much access to capital, how important that is, and not just in the moment, but for sustaining organizational infrastructure into the future. So what we're seeing, the conversations that we're having, and what I've seen, I would hope that would continue. There are ways, thinking about carving out funds for, unrestricted funds, but carving those out for a cash reserve fund, and really thinking about those things that make organizations sustain and strong, and if they want to scale. But access to capital, unless you have it, you're thinking about it, and then it just becomes a hamster wheel of trying to raise that money. So I would encourage the donor and foundation community to continue that conversation. The other thing that, and institutionalize and operationalize it. The other thing that I didn't share earlier that I think is important is that my two organizations that you mentioned earlier actually were going through a merger pre-pandemic. And going through the pandemic actually strengthened our resolve for that this was the right thing to do, as challenging as it was to sort of lead two organizations in the middle of a pandemic and care for staff who are supporting 19,000 children and families was truly a huge feat. So I've got, gray hair now. But it actually created the space for, I think, the organizations here to think differently about how we execute strategic partnerships on up to mergers and acquisitions. And, to see the foundation and funding community actually support that work with contributions financially to make it not necessarily easier, but help it to come to fruition. Because I truly think, although the sector may be okay right now, this okayness will not sustain for the next couple of years. It's a halo moment because there's influx of funding and support, but we've got to really think about how to ensure the sustainability of how organizations are navigating right now and managing to be okay in this moment.
And Dara, let's stick on this for a minute, because what about, the toll that this has taken on the people who, like yourselves, and your staffs. So you're working with vulnerable communities, people who are living with a lot of uncertainty. Your staff are trying to support taking on that stress, right? And how have you thought about that? I mean, both for yourself in terms of making sure that you're able to sustain yourself as a leader, as well as for your staff, to the extent that you're comfortable sharing. I'd love to hear that and from each of you, and then also ideas for how donors and foundations can support leaders and staff. Mm-hmm. Dara, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure, I do. Thankfully, we had a donor who years ago set up a fund to support our staff members going through professional development, so different types of certifications and education throughout the year. And we talked to that donor last year and asked if we could redirect those funds to staff welfare, and we're able to then provide ways that our staff members could tap into not just the EAP program, but we brought in different professionals to create a series of Zooms so the staff members could talk about how they need to decompress, how they can manage their own stress, how they can support their families. The truth of the matter is that the vast majority of our staff members live around the same wage as the participants that we serve. So their reality is very similar. They're in and of those communities as well. So we as a leadership team provide a lot of options and opportunities for staff members to create their own wellness plan, and we supported it. We had funding to support that, and we actually continue to do that because we also have staff members who are dealing with vaccine hesitancy. So we are in the space of trying to make sure that our staff are healthy and well taken care of, because this fall we're planning to be 100% in the physical workspace. We've been working, but just 100% in the physical workspace. And so we're looking differently at how we provide that health and wellness support for team members. But thankfully, we had a donor who allowed us to reallocate those funds to do that.
That's great. David?
And one more thing, I just remind our team members always to give ourselves grace and give other team members grace, because the level of stress that the sector has gone through is literally unimaginable.
Yes.
And we have to know that we all have the heart of the people in mind, and that there's always positive intent, and we have to give ourselves grace, right? Sometimes you have to be able to show up as your full self in order to truly support children and families. And so that's a constant reminder that I have to give myself, and then also to our team members.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say it would help if societally we could celebrate folks like your staff, or leaders like you, as much as we celebrate, the corporate titans heading off in rocket ships. And at that very moment, his AirPods die. Hold on one second. Hey. All right, there we go. David and Jarrett, I'm really curious if you could speak to this question of just the people.
Did you buy those AirPods on Amazon? You were talking, Jeff Bezos just got you back.
Nope.
Just exiting orbit, right?
Target.
Just press that button. That's so funny. So yeah, I think for us, we were a small team of 6. I think COVID, because of the pivots, right, and the vast acceleration of work into new ventures and new areas, it really was a tough thing for our team. And we've had over this last year 2 folks transition out of our team because COVID, right? And so I think, and we tried to do our best in like creating a more a culture in which we could show up in person and enroll, and also recognizing the system that we operate in, right? So we've been sort of organizing our staff meetings in a way in which we reflect, we do readings, we connect with each other, right? And I think we recognized really early on that we were living at work. And so we transitioned to a 4-day work week pretty quickly. And yet most of our staff worked more, right? We couldn't turn it off. And I think in some ways how we've showed up to support our sector and the folks in our sector have been, we end up doing more, right? We end up holding more convenings, more connections,
right,
more ways for people to connect with each other. And I think that was all our own sweat equity, right? We weren't funded to do any of that. We weren't funded to do any of that sort of what I sort of characterize as like classical leadership development work. Dara and I met in an incredible program 8 years ago, run by Independent Sector. But that was largely because American Express had funded us to do that, right? And so funded us to participate. And like, we didn't get any of that funding. Because we had imagined, many of us have gone through that programming and been able to sort of bring that into our sector. And I think that's like we can't live on sweat equity forever, right? And I think that's probably true again for many organizations who are delivering way above what they'd said they would do in their strategic plan or in their plan to their funders.
Yeah. And it's so important to connect this to Dara's point about unrestricted support and capitalization. And also worth noting that at the very moment you said we all transitioned to, working at home, Hannah's cat made an appearance. But Jarrett, you were gonna, it was as if we had trained it to do so. Jarrett, how did you think about this? About, both for the staff at the Community Foundation, but also the leaders and staff at the organizations that you support?
So one of the most, I'm going to sort of give you an answer that's sort of adjacent to the
Sure.
question you've asked, but this is one of the things that was most striking to me. I'm curious, Hannah, if this is something that came out in the report. Some of the most interesting philanthropy that we did, right? There was the urgency, but there were a lot of nonprofits. Remember, the early days of the pandemic, a lot of organizations were faced with laying off large numbers of staff. Many struggled with that fact. And the way some of these organizations responded was to, in essence, repurpose some of their staff into new areas, new service delivery. A lot of organizations we funded to do food work were not organizations that before the pandemic had been in the food distribution space. They were organizations that had community connection, they knew community, and through partnerships with the food bank, what have you, they turned employees who hadn't been doing that into a food distribution network at a time when it was really critical that we have that. And then as related matter, so for some of those organizations, right, on the one hand, that's really great, right? They're keeping employees sort of engaged, but they're also doing new stuff, which can be scary. How do you deliver a service that is so critical and make sure that you're doing it well? And then with this foundation looking over your shoulder to make sure that you actually did what you said you were going to do. That was maybe that's, Dara, this isn't exactly the grace that you referenced, right? But it's grace nonetheless, right? I think in all of us, we're in this very critical moment. We had, and again, Los Angeles isn't everywhere, we had 3 million food insecure people in our county. And it was a huge issue that we just said yes instead of asking more questions as part of our diligence too. And for that staff, right, there was the concern about doing a new job, about whether they were going to stay employed. There was the concern of COVID, right? Maybe I had a desk job before and now I'm out in the community at a time when people are getting sick. And so there were a lot of different concerns that were wrapped up in, I think, to make it an anxious moment for grantees, and to really support innovation where we saw it. And I would call that innovation, right? It's not a new idea, but it's for your organization doing something new in that moment to meet an emergent need was with the kind of courage in our nonprofit sector that we were proud to support.
Yeah,
or even
that's great.
if I could just sort of underline that really quickly, I think we saw here in Milwaukee, like, you know, the fact that we were continuing to convene people virtually to bring people together to understand what organizations needed and what other organizations could provide led to some really interesting partnerships and ways that got our arts and culture community connected to neighborhood groups in ways that they never would have, right? So just one really quick story. One neighborhood group said, we need paper cleaning products and a van because we need to get cleaning kits to our neighborhood members. And there, you may remember, right? You couldn't buy disinfectant, you couldn't buy paper towels anywhere. The leader of a performing arts center here in Milwaukee was like, hey, why don't we get you in our supply chain? We can order from all the institutional partners that we're ordering from. Let us know what you need. Another small arts and culture group was like, hey, we have a van that we're not using because we're not delivering programming. Why don't you borrow it? And that led to these deep connections between these two groups that never really would have been able to connect in that way. And then at the end of that meeting, they were like, keep doing the art stuff, right? Because our folks still need it too, right? But we need this stuff now. And I think that was just like, I mean, for us to have been able to catalyze that partnership, I mean, I think that really sort of like underscored the point of why convening, which feels like a sort of soft thing, right, is so important. It brings people together, makes connections, and develops these new sort of quote unquote innovative partnerships.
Yeah, thank you. We got just a couple minutes left. Hannah, anything you want to add from the data on anything that we've been talking about, including this particular question of sort of, you know, supporting staff or anything that came to mind?
Yeah, so one thing that came up a lot when I spoke to nonprofit leaders in recent months was the topic of silver linings. Like, I didn't even ask, like, what is the silver lining of the pandemic? People would just tell me, which was wonderful. And people talked about like having more authenticity in their relationships with funders. There was like less of a guard between the two because just everything was so wacky for everyone with the pandemic. And people talk about innovation and collaborating with people they never would have before, and just lots of different ways of working that they've found beneficial. And so I think there has been a lot of silver linings from the pandemic for a lot of nonprofits, although of course it still is bad, but.
Right. No, I think that's I think that's great. And we will only continue the good things that we were forced to do if we take stock of what they were and are self-conscious and aware about the choice to continue to work differently, because it would be very easy to default back in, as nonprofits and as donors, the normal patterns. And if we do that, if donors do that, if nonprofits do that, will be a huge missed opportunity. And there will be enormous costs relative to what is possible. We have just a couple minutes left. I am so grateful, Hannah, to you and Kate and Ellie for the research, Dara, Jarrett, and David, to each of you for your perspectives. I'm going to offer, Hannah, you just had a great closing thought. I'm going to offer Dara, Jarrett and David the opportunity, one closing thought you want to leave folks with, even if it's just to underline something that you already said, to make sure folks keep it in their mind as they move on from this webinar to the rest of their day.
I love that folks share with Hannah silver linings, because I truly believe even in the darkest of times, there is a silver lining, right? And one of the things that I often think about is actually when George Floyd was murdered and how the country sort of stood still. And I remember asking myself or making the comment, I truly hope that this collective grief, wherever you were in the country, that this collective grief turns into collective action, so that we are at a place where we ask ourselves, how might I make life better for my fellow citizen? Wherever I am, like, how might I do that? And so I am hopeful that within private philanthropy, within the nonprofit sector, that we continue to ask ourselves that, and that we not go back to what is known and what is comfortable, but that we sit in being uncomfortable and a little bit of overwhelm for a while, because that forces us to ask these questions and hopefully come up with whatever that silver lining might be.
That's great. Thank you so much for that.
You know, I think
David.
for me, I think the pandemic kind of sort of exposed this possibility that the apple cart had been turned over, right? There's all this new possibility. And so I think for us, the silver lining is, right, like, can we hold on to that sense of possibility of doing things different ways, right? And not to sort of snap back to the old ways of doing it. And I think I would just go back to how Jarrett had opened his commentary at the beginning, which is that, like, while things might not be as scary now, I think for everybody on this webinar, I think it's so important to recognize, and this is true for all nonprofits, but particularly true for arts and culture groups, because there have been increased requirements and new infrastructure and new investments they've made to make the experience safer. Once the performing arts season starts next, at least in Milwaukee in the fall, it's just money out the door, right? And so the need for support for arts and culture groups and nonprofits, generally speaking, is not going to go away. It is still going to be incredibly high as we reemerge. And so I think thinking about the immediate time, right? We're through relief, right? And now we're sort of entering that period of recovery. And so I think for folks to keep that in mind, and again, to remember all the things we talked about regarding flexibility and all of that stuff, let's keep that spirit going into 2022.
Thank you, David. Jarrett, we've got 1 minute.
Great. Never let a good crisis go to waste. This was a crisis. We in philanthropy learned a lot about our grantees and about our giving. Let's see what we can carry forward, and remember those organizations and communities that we learned, assuming we were studying what we were doing, that we learned perhaps had the greatest need during COVID. They're likely to still have some needs, and let's think about how we can recommit, apply our learnings and recommit to philanthropy that supports those needs that we've learned of. That's it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thank you all. Thanks to everybody who joined. In addition to the folks at CEP I've already thanked, I just want to thank Grace, who opened us up, and her team members, Say, Jay, and Sarah, who worked behind the scenes on this webinar. We had hundreds of people sign up and hundreds of people join. I hope it was helpful to you. I'm so grateful. Hannah, Dara, Jarrett, David, you were great. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day. Take care. And happy birthday, Dara.